Poignant! Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Now, I'm not sure what happened there, but I can tell you that it wasn't looking good. So what I did was I just restarted. And, okay. So let's start with an introduction to Dr. Susan Vosloo. Dr. Susan Vosloo was the first woman surgeon to perform a human-to-human heart transplant. Susan knew Chris Barnard very well. Now, of course, we all know about Chris Barnard. In 1967, Chris Barnard operated on Louis Washkansky in Groote Hospital for 6 hours in the early morning of 3rd of December 1967. Let's look at a short video on Dr. Chris Barnard and that first heart transplant. Here we go.
On the 3rd of December 1967, surgeon Christian Barnard performed the world's first human-to-human heart transplant. Barnard was head of the Department of Experimental Surgery at the Groote Hospital in Cape Town when he performed the pioneering surgery. Having previously performed successful kidney transplants, his team identified 53-year-old grocer Louis Washkansky as a suitable recipient of a donor heart. Washkansky had developed chronic heart disease, but had previously been an active sportsman and was said to have displayed a tenacious determination to hold on to his life. On Saturday, the 2nd of December, 25-year-old Denise Darval and her mother were struck by a drunk driver while crossing the road. Although her mother died at the scene, Denise was transferred to Groote Hospital, where she was diagnosed as brain dead. While a respirator maintained the beat of her heart, doctors approached her father, who agreed to their request to donate the organ. The operation began shortly after midnight. Dozens of specialists made up the team involved in the revolutionary surgery, and shortly before 6 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd of December, electric shocks brought Washkansky's new heart into action. Immunosuppressant drugs intended to stop his body rejecting the new tissue contributed to him dying from pneumonia 18 days later. Despite this sad end, Professor Barnard quickly gained international acclaim for his pioneering surgery. His technique was quickly adopted around the world, but heart transplants continued to suffer from significant complications, at least until the development of cyclosporine, a more effective immunosuppressant drug, in the 1970s.
All right, guys, there's the... I'm having a great time here. Sorry, guys. There's that short video of Chris Barnard and his amazing heart transplant that just changed everything in the world today. Now, let's get on to our guest tonight, Dr. Susan Vosloo. She was born in South Africa, underwent schooling and pre-graduate medical training in Bloemfontein, South Africa, obtaining an MB CHB at the University of the Free State in 1980. She got further training in the congenital and pediatric cardiac surgery, was done at the Harley Street Clinic and Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London, UK. Now, guys, just give me a second. I've just got to put a comment in the old thread just so the people know where to find it. Okay, I'm just going to save that and then we're ready. Okay, done. All right, so getting back to Susan Vosloo. Since 1991, in independent private cardiothoracic practice at Christian Barnard Memorial Hospital, Cape Town, with special interests in surgery for congenital heart defects and cardiac transplantation. She is a founder member of the World Society for Pediatric and Congenital Heart Surgery, or WSPCHS, and past member of the WSPCHS Governing Council. She is co-chair and member of the International Steering Committee for the World Congress of Pediatric Cardiology and Cardiac Surgery, or WCPCCS, and vice chairman of the organizing committee for the 6th Quadrennial WCPCCS in Cape Town, and that was in February 2013. She's a member of IPTA, or the International Pediatric Transplant Association Congress Subcommittee for the 9th IPTA Congress, Vancouver, Canada, 2019. Susan has served on the University Council of the UFS since 2004, and in addition is the UFS Council representative in the UFS Senate and the Standing Advisory Committee of the School of Medicine, UFS, and the Free State Provincial Department of Health. Now, before we get Susan on, I must apologize for the problems that we had with the original live stream. I don't know what happened. It's the first time it's ever happened on one of my live streams with over 200. You could see that it just magnified a little piece of the screen, although on the streaming software it actually showed it perfectly correct, which is why I had no choice but to create a new live stream, because we couldn't run it like that. So, now without any further ado, let me get our guest, Dr. Susan Vosloo, on Skype. Here we go. Hi, Susan.
Hi, good evening, Scott.
Sorry we're a few minutes late. What happened was we had a little technical issue with the the streaming software, and everything was magnified, and it just wasn't operating, so I had to start a whole new thread. But we're up and running. We've got about 150 people watching us right now. I'm sure a lot will catch on where we are very shortly, so we should have a good crowd. Now,
Yes.
I've mentioned that you have had a close association, working association with Dr. Chris Barnard in the past. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's start by discussing your memories of growing up in South Africa.
Scott, I was born in the Free State, and most of my growing up was in Bloemfontein, where I went to school and also went to university. I qualified in 1980, and then did my internship in Pretoria before I went back to Bloemfontein for a year to work in an intensive care unit. In those days, intensive care was in its infant shoes, and it was great experience to have if one intended to have a career in surgery.
Right. Now, tell us about the influence of your father on your career, or your decision to go into medicine.
I think one's always influenced by your parents. My father was an orthopedic surgeon. He was quite dedicated to his career, and he trained in Johannesburg and then had a practice for most of his life in Bloemfontein. As a child, even when I could barely walk, I used to go to him on house visits while he was a general practitioner in a small town. And when he was in Bloemfontein and I was studying, I used to accompany him in the evenings and sort of assisted him with emergency cases, which were never major procedures, but it was quite stimulating. Over weekends I used to walk with him, and I think that set quite an example for me, and something that I think was always something to strive for, because he was really a great man.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, being interested in medicine, you must have been really excited when you heard about Chris Barnard performing the first heart transplant. Where were you at that time?
Yeah, I remember it very clearly. I was 10 years old at the time. We were on a family holiday in Mossel Bay, and in those days it came over the news. It was one of those events, a little bit like the moon landing, which was also in the latest 1960s. And it's something that you remember where you were at the time. And we heard it in those days on the radio, and every day there was an update. And Mr. Washkansky lived for 18 days. And I didn't know at that time that would be where my career would also take me.
Right. Now, tell us about your memories about working with Dr. Chris Barnard. I mean, you spent quite a lot of time with him. Just take us through how you met him and basically how the working relationship developed, and just tell us about that.
I first met him when I was working in the intensive care unit it was then about 1982, and there was a conference where he was a guest speaker. But at that time I was in the audience. When I came to Cape Town was 1984, and he had just retired the year before. So I never formally worked with him. There were lots of anecdotes in the department because he was really a larger than life character. I really met him, and in 1988, it was the 21st anniversary of the first transplant, right. And Professor Reichardt, a German surgeon who was my chief under whom I trained, arranged a little function to commemorate the 21st anniversary of the first transplant, and that's where I really met him. So my association with him was not a true working relationship, but more of a personal, professional relationship, because he used to ask me always for slides. In those days we gave presentations with slides. He always used to ask me what was the latest in a procedure, if anybody asked his advice. And then because I don't think he was really appreciated enough in his own country, and that was always for me really sad. He then set up a foundation in Austria in those days,
right.
And under his foundation he ran a charity project where only children with congenital heart defects that required surgery that was not available where they were. He brought them to Cape Town, and I operated on them in the then City Park Hospital. He was very supportive when I was asked by the hospital management in those days to establish a private cardiac transplant unit, which we started around 1995 with great resistance. So we were not really supported in that. He was very supported. The owner of the hospital group in those days, Mr. Barney Hurwitz, who owned a company called Clinic Holdings, was very keen for this. And I think he was one of those people with vision. And in those days, resources were under a lot of pressure in the state sector, and there were also the possibility that transplantation, as too much of a sophisticated form of medicine, would be discontinued in the state sector, and the patients would have nowhere to go.
Right.
So we started that, and it was really a good ally to have on one's side.
Right. Now, I just want to address the side chat for a moment. Guys, if you have got questions you'd like to put to Susan, please just post them into the side chat. And if the okay, we got a fellow here. This is quite interesting. It's such a small world. Ismail Nordin says, Susan did my bypass years ago in City Hospital, 25 years ago. She did a fantastic job. No problem since. Thanks, Doc. There you go. You remember Ismail Nordin?
No,
I suppose you do so many.
Yes, we do a fair number of cases.
Right. Okay, let's continue on. Now, you mentioned children. You mainly work with children, don't you, when it comes to surgery and that sort of area?
Yes, my practice is more or less 60% children. Not many surgeons in our field do surgery for congenital heart defects. It's a little bit more demanding. It's a little bit more diverse, but it's a very interesting field in the field of cardiac surgery.
Right. Okay, and I have to ask you this question. A lot of people said that Dr. Barnard was hard to work with. How did you find him?
I always found him very charming. He had a great sense of humor. He was a very intelligent man who cared a lot for his fellow man. In the anecdotes, there were anecdotes of him being difficult, but also at the same time, the anecdotes were more an illustration of the high standards he set. He was not very tolerant of anybody who would not aspire to the same level of care that he delivered. But I don't think if you worked hard, if you worked well with him, most people that trained with him that I came across in my training were actually very fond of him.
Right. Now, someone sent me a email earlier this evening to ask you this question, and it's a very interesting question because I remember this case. This happened, I think, a couple of years ago, and I'll just read to you what he says. He says, "Hi there, Scott. Hope you're doing well. Heard you're interviewing Dr. Vosloo tonight, South African time. Would like you to ask her about a Hamilton Naki, a person that allegedly mentored Professor Barnard, if you believe the spin set out by the regime." And then he says, absolute hogwash. He says, "I remember reading it in a paper years ago, totally extraordinary. Being a medical professional myself and discreetly asking my peers, they concurred it's complete nonsense." Did you hear about that?
I know everything about that.
Oh, tell us about it.
When I was doing my training, Hamilton and another man called Boots, they were the helpers in the animal lab. Now, I really didn't like working there, but under Professor Reichardt, we were all in a way bullied to do our share of work there.
Right.
We operated on the baboons. I did a lot of heart-lung transplants on baboons, and we used to save the heart and the lungs for 6 hours and 12 hours and 24 hours. It was very interesting because after 24 hours before you have the organs reimplanted, the heart was still working, but the lungs didn't do so well.
Right.
But Hamilton was working in the lab with us. He was extremely skilled, extremely knowledgeable, and a very, very nice man. He started off as a gardener who was then taken in by the lab, and he played a huge role in this being quite a successful surgical research lab. When Professor Barnard died, there was a filmmaker who's also since passed away. His name was Dirk de Villiers. Now, Dirk had a lot of video footage of Professor Barnard, which he used in different ways. But at the time, it's just my subjective opinion, I think he wanted to market his video material in a way that he portrayed a racial angle to it. And he implied, and so did another, I think, Scandinavian group that made a video, created the impression that the first heart transplant was actually done by Hamilton Naki. That was completely untrue. I think no non-qualified medical person would have been allowed in the old days into Groote Schuur hospitals theatres, let alone do the surgery. And one day, Dirk de Villiers and Hamilton, who I really knew very well, came to my office. And Dirk wanted to do an interview, and he wanted Hamilton to tell me how he did the first heart transplant, which was really not correct. And both Hamilton and myself were most uncomfortable with this situation. And he never did the video. So at least we did not agree to do something that's not factually correct. Hamilton, as a disadvantaged person in the past, I think was given a lot of credit for that he very well deserved. And in his name, the current company that runs our hospitals have set up a special bursary that helps people to study. And I think that is really a huge contribution that he is making, because education at this stage is the most important part of our society. And if one could, in honor of someone that really made a huge contribution also towards the first heart transplant, is well deserved. I'm not sure if I'm putting it clear enough.
No, that certainly clarifies that. And I heard that they were going to try and honour this fellow in some way, because the ANC government suggested he did do the first heart transplant. But anyway, we now have it clarified and cleared up. I want to share a story with you, and this goes back to my days at Barclays Bank in Escort. The branch had 3 bank agencies that it manned during the week, including one at the town of Winterton near Champagne Castle in the Drakensberg. No one realized at this time, which was the late 1970s, early 1980s, that Dr. Chris Barnard and his second wife, the beautiful Barbara Zollner, were holidaying at Champagne Castle. The teller who went out to Winterton that day, a real smartass, arrived back at Escort and could not contain himself. He told us how Dr. Barnard's beautiful wife had come into the bank agency to draw cash, but his story was somewhat different. Now, you have to understand that this guy was in his 30s, bald, fat, and rather ugly, but he proclaimed with the biggest smile I ever saw, "She told me she craved my bod." Yeah, but she did. She actually came into the bank agency, and that was like the highlight of the year for the Escort Barclays Bank. Yeah. Now, just on a personal level, I have to tell you, my stomach turns when I just see blood. It must be quite an amazing moment when you're holding a human heart in your hand as you prepare to give life and hope to someone. Tell me what it feels like at that moment in time.
I think we work with a lot of blood, and if that is, I think what makes it tolerable, and what makes it that you do not have a negative experience when you see blood, is when you understand how it works. We often have students visiting, and some students do feel a bit uncomfortable when they first enter, when they first see the heart. But what I find is that if you explain to them the structures and how it works, the interest and the focus changes to what is more interesting about this than actually the gruesome blood. I myself, I wouldn't like to encounter an accident or somebody being hurt or something like that. But somehow it's not the sensation one experiences when you do the work.
Right. Okay. Now, Christian Barnard sent a few pictures, a speech at function renaming the city park to Christian Barnard Memorial Hospital on the 8th of November 2001. Tell me about your emotions at the time when you were part of that renaming of the hospital. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just show a few images of you with Dr. Chris Barnard. So if you just want to tell us about that.
Okay, shall I just talk while you do
Yeah,
that?
yeah, just talk and talk us through the emotions that you felt at that time.
Yes, in the early 1990 or during the 1990s, the major challenge, and as it is now, is organs for transplantation. So I played quite a role in those days at the Organ Donor Foundation. We used to have functions. We had a fashion show. We had art shows. We used to do some fundraisings for the foundation, and in those social events, it was always a huge advantage to have Professor Barnard as the guest speaker, and he was really very supportive of that. So the first outstanding event was for me the fact that his last event that he attended in Cape Town before he left on a trip abroad, during which he died, was a function that we held as at the Organ Donor Foundation, and he always had the audience absolutely in his power, and he was funny and he was entertaining, and there are lots of little anecdotes that I can tell you about that. He then left and died of what was an asthma attack. In the time before he left, he was often a bit breathless, and he actually had this inhaler that he used to use all the time, and he did agree to see a pulmonologist when he came back, and somehow it just never happened. But what was interesting when he died, and he died it was about the beginning of September of 2001. So we were the Cape Town City held for him a memorial service, and at the memorial service, the man who was at that time the director of his foundation suggested that we name something in the hospital after him. He thought we should name the cath labs or the cardiac wards, because already then we had a little auditorium where we used to do talks and symposia, which was named after Professor Barnard, and he actually cut the ribbon when that was opened. So after the memorial service, we went back to my office, and the man came with me. He was called Walter Lutzinger, and Mr. Lutzinger said, well, shall we maybe do something like that? It was not really in my power to suggest something, but I offered to phone the hospital manager and say, and ask the hospital manager what his opinion was of that. As luck had it, Richard Friedland, who was the managing director of Netcare, was in Cape Town at the time, and he also came to my office, and we had this discussion. And Richard said he thinks if we do a renaming, we do it properly, and we do something that will be a memorial for the life of Professor Barnard. So we finished the discussion. He was going to speak to all the other doctors that worked there and ask their opinions. And as we walked into the waiting room, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the television that was in our waiting room showed the images of the aeroplanes flying into the Twin Towers in New York. So that was that I will absolutely never forget. Yeah. So what we did then is they put a really nice function together, which was on his birthday on the 8th of November of 2001. Of course, Richard Friedland then approached his family and asked permission, and they all agreed that this was an appropriate way of honoring him for the contributions he's made to medicine in the world and to Cape Town and South Africa in particular.
Right. Now, the whole process of transplanting hearts has changed dramatically. I mean, the medicines used to support the heart transplant and stuff like that have absolutely changed dramatically, and so have some of the processes and stuff like that. Can you give us a historical perspective and current state of the art of heart transplants and how it's changed?
Yes, it was a wonderful time to actually be living in cardiac surgery. The history was fairly fresh in the 1980s, but just in brief, Professor Barnard, when he finished surgery, he spent time at the, I think it wasn't at the Mayo Clinic, was I think at Minneapolis, which was in those days far ahead in cardiac surgery. The heart-lung machine was developed by a man called Lilley, and the heart-lung machine, in essence, does exactly what its name says. It takes the blood that returns from the body into a machine which acts as the heart and the lungs. In other words, it keeps the circulation pumping, and it also provides oxygen, which is the function of the lung. And if the heart is supported by the heart-lung machine, one can isolate the heart itself and give a solution that we call cardioplegia. It's usually cold and has a high potassium content, and what that does, it cools, it's washed through the coronary arteries, it cools the heart, it paralyzes it, and one can do whatever work is necessary on that. Now, Professor Barnard returned from the United States in 1953-54, I'm not exactly sure when, with a heart-lung machine, which was given to him by Professor Lilley. And with this heart-lung machine in Cape Town, he started open heart surgery. And that was probably in the early 60s, I'm not sure when. And he was also interested in the surgery for congenital heart defects, and he had a really good series of outstanding outcomes. In 1967, in December, the first heart transplant was done. What was interesting in the early times, in the early period after that transplant, which if you step back, and there's quite a lot written about this, I think he was the best qualified to take this step for several reasons. The one is he was brave enough to do that, which I think many of the particularly American surgeons were very hesitant to take the step, although they were all working towards the same goal. The other reason, in my opinion, is that he was more widely prepared. In other words, he didn't just do the operation, which is an easy operation, 100 times to make him do a transplant. There's far more involved in doing heart transplantation than just the technical surgery. He also was prepared in immunology, in matching the donor with the recipient, and in the aftercare, which is the important immunosuppression or anti-rejection medication that the patients need to take. So he prepared much better than people that were more focused on only a part of the procedure. Now that preparation is well reflected in history, because since he did it, there was a number of heart transplants done worldwide by different centers who all did some preparation. But his patients lived the longest. The first one lived 18 days. I think there wasn't, for the next several months, anybody lived more than 14 days. And his next patient was a dentist called Philip Blyberg. Yes. He lived for 1.5 years. Yeah. And then quite a number of those early patients lived for several years, and some of them we looked after in the 1980s while I was doing my training. Rejection was always a big problem, and I think the selection of patients were also sometimes really unnecessary high-risk patients. So those two factors were compromising the outcomes. He then had an anecdote about a patient that he operated on who died, and when he went home, his son asked him, but why don't you just put back the old heart? And that's where the idea came of the heterotopic heart transplant that was popular in the 1970s. That is where, and the heart is actually not taken out and replaced, but the donor heart is then put as an assisting organ for the weak heart. And sometimes there were patients where that technique was used, and the heart recovered, the own hearts recovered, and this heart could be removed. But this operation was technically quite challenging, and reoperations in those cases were very difficult. So that it's not really being used anymore today. But the major breakthrough in transplantation came with immunosuppression. In the 1980s, a drug called cyclosporin was developed, and that made a big difference to outcomes. The and anti-rejection therapy has only become more and more sophisticated in the last few decades.
So really what we're talking about is that when Chris Barnard performed the first heart surgery or heart transplant, it's rather like, if we look at the technological example, it's rather like he was operating with an old XT computer, which only had like the mono screen and really basic. And today with the heart surgery, you've got like really sophisticated computers which do just about everything. So the transformation has been dramatic from when he did that first heart transplant.
Exactly, and it's like that in all areas. I mean, if you look at the telephones we were using, the cars we were driving, and in medicine, it's just spectacular how much development there is.
Yeah, and I think the thing that you said that really struck a chord with me was when you said that he had the courage to take that first step, because when that athlete, I've forgotten his name, but he broke the 4-minute mile, then all of a sudden everybody started breaking the 4-minute mile. It's like you've got to have someone who's got the guts to get up there and actually make it happen, and then the others follow. And obviously Chris Barnard did that.
Exactly, and I think we as a country, we owe him a lot.
Absolutely.
For doing that. I don't think he was ever appreciated enough in his own country, and that's something I really found sad, because when I was really young and going to conferences and references were made to Professor Barnard and remarkable other contributions he's made to his field of surgery, and sometimes somebody would make a comment that is really inappropriate, and I didn't have the courage in those days to argue about that, but I always felt guilty about that, and it usually came from people who did not nearly make a contribution to the same extent as he did.
Right. Okay, now just moving on, tell us about this process called mechanical circulatory support.
Mechanical circulatory support is really the development of a heart-lung machine for longer support of the circulation. As time passed, the heart-lung machine parts and the way it functioned became more and more sophisticated, and it became smaller, it became more effective, it became safer, and from this, a new science developed, which is called mechanical circulatory support. That is used also for two reasons. Sometimes it's used only for support of the heart, sometimes it's used only for support of the lungs, and sometimes it's used to support both. There is it's far more commonly used. It can be used for longer times, and from that developed more permanent forms of circulatory support, something that we would call a left heart assist devices. These are really small mechanical circulatory support devices that patients can actually mobilize with. Things like this is used when the heart fails and it needs to be supported, but one doesn't want to have a patient attached to a heart-lung machine and bedbound in a hospital, because there is no quality of life in those cases. The left ventricular assist devices developed really in the first decade after the year 2000, and is very popular and tremendously growing in use. Initially, it was used for what we call a bridge to transplantation. In other words, when the heart is so bad that the patient would maybe pass away before a suitable donor comes. But later, it was shown that these patients often tolerate this device very well and for many months. I'm not sure how many years the devices are in for the longest, but it was then the indications changed from bridge to transplantation to what they call destination therapy,
right,
where someone would say, I would rather keep my left ventricular assist device and not take the anti-rejection medication, because this really works well for me and I do not want to complicate my life further. But this is definitely a new field that is growing in as we speak.
right. Now, I just want to address the side chat for a moment. We got well over 200 people watching right now. Dan Berryman asks, and before I give his question, this is what we do in our live streams. Probably once every 3 to 6 months I make this proclamation, and Dan Berryman is the latest person to become a channel hero. Congratulations, Dan. Dan is our resident priest, and every Sunday he puts up a Sunday service on our main channel, which is followed by a lot of people, and he's a lovely man. And he's asked this question. He says, please ask Dr. Vosloo, I have 60% heart function after an infarct, now having 2 stents. Should I avoid COVID like the plague?
I think if he has 60% function, he actually has normal function. The 60% or the percentage that is placed on heart function, it's normal if that figure is between 40 and 60%. The percentage is used to describe something known as ejection fraction. It describes how much the left ventricle empties during contraction. Now, it can never be 100% because the cavity doesn't empty to absolutely nothing. So when the heart pumps, 40 to 60% of the volume in the left ventricle is ejected into the circulation. So anybody with an ejection fraction of 40 to 60% actually has 100% normal function. So from that point of view, I think he can be reassured, because that is normally how one expresses heart muscle function. In terms of COVID, I think everybody has to respect the disease. It would be irresponsible to not take it seriously. And particularly people with comorbidities, mostly being overweight. I think that's a major factor, but not many people voice it too often. The second is comorbidities like cardiovascular disease, also being diabetic, hypertensive, are the main comorbidities that cause bad outcomes with the COVID disease. Old age is also an extremely important factor, and it's really been shown all over the world that most of the people that die are really old, and that may have contributed quite a lot to the high mortality in Europe and in the United States. The picture here is still evolving. We have a young population, but there are patients in our population that are challenged by other diseases, and particularly HIV and tuberculosis. So it's hard to know how much young age would be beneficial and how much of a factor, a negative factor would be introduced by other comorbidities that are not so common in Europe and the United States, like tuberculosis.
Right. Now, I have to tell you that let's discuss this COVID thing for a moment, then we'll get back to the heart area, because this is really disturbing when you look at this, the severity of this lockdown on the economy around the world. And my attention was drawn to a United Kingdom official government guidance in March this year, which removed COVID-19 from its list of high consequence infectious diseases, or HCID, which currently includes SARS and MERS. So they obviously recognize COVID-19 as being a lesser evil than these other diseases, which are HCIDs. Now, I have a question for you. Why do you think there is a global lockdown right now because of this coronavirus?
It's hard to say. I think we are, in a way, paying the price of better communication. The media and social media have really made this into something far bigger than it is. The coronavirus is a different coronavirus from the one that did, for instance, the MERS. The Middle Eastern respiratory virus was actually much more lethal. In other words, a much larger percentage of the patients that had the infection died. SARS, I think, was quite infectious. Now, I'm not a specialist in that field, but we all read reports. Yeah. This infection, when it started, of course, it's a dramatic infection. If patients become ill, it's dramatic. It's a short-lived infection. It's not only affecting the lungs. There is a component of increased blood clotting. There is a component of a whole body inflammatory response, or what they call the cytokine storm. And the patients are really very, very sick, and they are most challenging to take care of. But one needs some perspective. If we look at South Africa itself, every year or annually, there are 11,000 deaths due to flu-related complications. Usually, of those, about 500 are children. It's hard to know what the figures will evolve to be in our country, and there are various models predicting what the anticipated mortality is. But we are now, as for today, I don't know, we may have been up to 2,000 with about, I think, 50,000 infections. We are in the curve, or approaching the peak, or approaching the surge, whatever you want, however you want to call it. But this is a very small percentage of the total population, and even if this 2,000 increases fivefold, it's still not going to be 11,000 after the season. I don't know what the answer will be, but of the worst hit countries, I think Belgium, for instance, has the highest mortality per million or per 100,000
Right.
of the population. And when I last looked a few days ago, the mortality in Belgium, which is, I think, of the worst in the world, has not even been 0.1% of the total population. And when this started, yes?
They were talking about it being 3% originally, weren't they?
I think the figure that we had was between 0.1 and 0.3%. So the worst country at this stage, where the epidemic is more or less towards the end, is, I think at this stage, is Belgium, and that is about approaching 0.1. Now, if one looks at the percentage of actual patients that tested positive, I think it's about 2% the mortality, but the testing is also not very accurate. People are tested. I know some colleagues that were tested like 3 or 4 times when they were feeling off color, and only the 4th test was positive. The delay in obtaining results of the test is also a major challenging factor, because to do a test where the result is only available 7 or 10 days later, it loses a bit of its impact, because it's hard to then do the tracing that should follow the testing. And ultimately, I do not think whatever you do, if one looks at the experience that's already known worldwide, the amount of lockdown is not stopping the virus.
No.
In a way, where you are, New Zealand and Australia, that were quite efficient on, in a way, stopping the virus. What will you do now? When will you travel? When will you allow people in your country? So there are downsides to being effective in stopping the virus. In our country, where a lot of people live from hand to mouth, there's a lot of informal workers. There is already a lot of poverty, and the lockdown, I think, is one of the cruelest measures that could ever happen, not only in this country, but across the world, because it disadvantaged so many people. And the gain, although the gain is claimed, I think is compared to the price on the economy in the first instance, the increase in poverty, and many other materialistic things. But overall, all non-COVID medical conditions are placed on the back burner. In other words, patients do not come for their chronic medications. They're scared to come to the hospital. They are maybe stopped in a roadblock. They need permits to do a lot of things. So the normal surveillance of other medical conditions is neglected, not deliberately, but it's not done. I heard this afternoon an interview with Professor Glenda Gray, and what she said is that the testing, for instance, the same laboratory technique that's used for testing for COVID is based on the tests for HIV and TB. So those tests that are also crucial is also moved backwards to accommodate this. Not that it's incorrect, but I think the price that we're going to pay in lives for non-COVID emergency is going to be bigger than the lives we saved with all these measures.
Well, I think the destruction of the economy has been absolutely catastrophic in South Africa, and I think it's a complete beat-up. I also think that a lot of people, probably, the number of people who have committed suicide since the lockdown is huge, and a
Yes,
lot
yes.
more than the people who've actually died from the virus itself. It is just crazy. Now,
Exactly.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions in Afrikaans, but if you can respond to them in English. Gerard's got to leave us very shortly, so he's got 2 questions for you. I'm just going to put both at the same time. He says, Dr. Vosloo, welkom hier. Ek wil net weet, volgens dokters, moet ek albei my bene sê, as so te sê vervang. Hulle gaan dood en lam. Wie stel jy voor, moet ek sien?
If I understand it correctly, he has reduced blood supply to his legs. Is that more or less
I think so, yeah.
what he meant?
Yes.
Yes. So that is what we would call peripheral vascular disease. It's very much the same disease that affect the coronary arteries that supply the heart muscle with blood. But those are taken care of by vascular surgeons. Vascular surgeons would do different techniques to improve the blood flow to the legs, and that would be where you should direct seeking advice.
Right, okay. So the second question from is basically the same, so we'll leave that. Okay, so getting back to COVID-19, was it the World Health Organization that was behind this lockdown, or was it? Why did it happen worldwide? There must have been some organization that said, "Hey, this is what you got to do."
I think no. I don't know if anybody will ever have that answer. I think a very basic flaw in the management. There are 2 very basic flaws in the management, just in general. The first is that it's a medical problem that is not dealt with by medical professionals like epidemiologists, family medicine expert, infectious disease expert. So this pandemic is dealt with by politicians and scientists with very little connection to the real world, and therefore and it's based sometimes on models that were inaccurate, and it's been most embarrassing, the scientific inaccuracies that came out of these models.
Yes.
The second is that now it slipped. I actually am not sure what I wanted to say. So it's run by the politicians. The second is that there's no appreciation for the collateral damage, and that is really sad. But the main, I think one of the main negatives of the way this is managed is that a lot of the way it's managed is actually remote from the actual reason why it's managed. Just to be as a simple example, the prohibition of alcohol and smoking. I mean, I'm not an alcohol. I don't use much alcohol, or I do not smoke. But the focus moved entirely from the safety measures to contain the virus, to protect vulnerable people, to isolate sick people, to a strict controlling approach where healthy people are locked up. More than 99% of the population is locked up. Less than 1% will be affected by this in any meaningful way, and it makes a very abnormal society, which makes very little sense. The authorities are really focused on the prosecution of people with cigarettes, with alcohol, and that should not be the focus. The focus should be on how do we protect people, how do we educate people, how do we make it better for people. somebody told me this morning, I think there's always some humor in the whole in the whole situation. So, for instance, if you cannot see your family, you cannot see your friends, but who you know are healthy, but you can get into a taxi with people that you know from nowhere, and people are commuting in taxis in this country. People are living in small rooms. I will never be convinced that it's better for a family to be in one room rather than have a father working on a building site, a mother who's a nurse, the kids going to school where they actually are fed a good meal every day. I don't think they are advantaged by this. And for instance, the adherence to the rules that are flawed is also worrying. Somebody told me this morning the taxi driver picks up some passengers. So, of course, all the passengers have to have masks. What it helped with quite a number of people in a taxi driving for more than 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, I'm not sure, because I think the air is all around the mask. But the passenger has to have a mask. So what happens when a passenger wants to get into a taxi and he doesn't have a mask? He gets the mask from the driver. Now, really, that actually is according to the rules, but is it at all to the benefit of the person? And those are the type of things that really make you just not understand why it's managed this way.
Well, I have to tell you, those taxis are like a petri dish. You know, people stuck in this little taxi, and someone's got it. They're going to infect everybody else. It's just ridiculous. Now, the other issue with this virus is that people who are asymptomatic, they don't show any signs of having the virus. There's now a lot of suggestion that the testing process is so flawed that it actually picks up people as having the virus when they don't have it, and that's what they call asymptomatic. And now there's this discussion: can asymptomatic people actually infect people who are not, who have not had the virus? It's just absolutely crazy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the test that is done picks up virus particles. We test, for instance, we test all our children that come for surgery. We do what they call a viral panel that does not include the coronavirus up to now. But so we often get quite meaningful viruses in patients that are totally asymptomatic. Now, in our setting, it's an important observation to make. For instance, the adenovirus can make children really ill. So if a patient is carrying the adenovirus and you do a major operation, they may have a very complicated post-operative course. But sometimes you send the kids home, they come back, they still have an adenovirus, because sometimes you measure the particles or leftover of the virus in this patient that has no risk to the patient, and sometimes the risk of waiting with intervention is more than the risk of waiting until this is gone. I don't really have the first-hand knowledge about this, but I do think that the virus particles that are picked up in asymptomatic patients are probably of lesser risk, because it seems that patients or people that are subjected to high viral loads, in other words, the sick person sneezes or coughs in your face,
right,
have the highest risk of getting severe disease. So the highest incidence in healthcare workers are those that intubate patients or that work in the upper airway, like ENT surgeons, like anesthetists. So there is a reason why these people are at higher risk, because they have more direct exposure. And if you have a very sick patient, a difficult intubation, unless you are really wearing the proper protective clothing, it's going to be a high risk. But if you are not physically very close to patients, people that are normal, I'm not sure if it's fair to treat everybody as if they are carrying something, because the stigma that comes with that is also very abnormal in society. And I'm not sure it's going to be to our benefit. Now that you've mentioned suicide, it actually is psychologically quite disturbing to view all your fellow citizens with suspicion, and that is quite a negative consequence of what we are dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, now, I just want to touch on a couple of things which are really the humorous side of, well, so it's not really humorous, but one of them is, I mean, those ambulance motorcycles in the Eastern Cape. We'll get to that in a second. But what about these Cuban doctors that have been brought over to South Africa? I'm aware there are about 300 to 400 fully qualified doctors who are basically from minority groups. There are some Africans amongst them who've actually done their medical training overseas, got their qualifications, come back to South Africa, and now the Health Professionals Council of South Africa, or the HPCSA, has made it almost impossible for them to actually qualify or actually be accepted as doctors to practice here in South Africa, despite actually getting their qualifications overseas. Now, the irony is, it's largely minority people who've actually paid for their own training or studying, and they've gone overseas because of the affirmative action policy of universities, where a white person, for example, who gets 7 straight A's will be overlooked in favor of someone who does much worse, but because they are an African. And this is why so many of these minority doctors have actually traveled overseas, got their qualifications, come back, and found that they can't practice here in South Africa. Don't you think that's wrong, when they're just bringing in all these Cuban doctors?
Yes, I think some of our students also trained in Cuba. It's never been quite clear which students are selected to train in Cuba. The students that go to Cuba, in the first year they need to learn Spanish. Then they do a fairly basic medical degree, which is maybe the equivalent of a BSc, and then they have very limited clinical experience. When they come back, they are allocated to the different medical schools in the country, and they need to concentrate their clinical training in a very short time to write another exam that will allow them to register, if I understand it correctly. Now, those students really battle to pass those exams the first time, and some need to write maybe several times again. The Cuban doctors that came now for to assist is also a bit unclear, because there are many doctors in this country that are looking for employment. There are South Africans maybe living abroad wanting to come back to South Africa. So it's hard to understand on what basis that has been done. There had been reports of Cuban doctors assisting elsewhere in humanitarian projects, and one has the impression that what they cost is not really what is what the actual doctors are earning, and one is uncertain where the difference in payment is going. And I think somebody needs to follow the paper trail in this regards. But there are so many things like this happening across the country that it is an injustice. Everybody gets really excited about it. It gets reported, but then often one never hears of that again.
Yeah, nothing gets done. Now, just turning back to the motorcycles, and then we'll get back to the heart surgery side. I'm sorry, we went off on a bit of a tangent, but we were going to be talking about this anyway. Now, these ambulance motorcycles in the Eastern Cape, I have never heard of anything as absolutely crazy is that? And the thing that really, there's, you can't make this stuff up. The government paid 100,000 rand per unit for these motorcycles when you can buy them on Alibaba online per unit for 17,500 rand. That's 17,500 rand. Where did the other 82,500 rand go? A, and B, are ambulance motorcycles a reliable option for taking critically injured or hurt or sick patients to a hospital?
What has been reported is that the modification of the motorcycles to have a sidecar maybe could have cost some money, but I'm not sure if it would have cost as much as the difference between what the basic model costs and what was paid for it. The other reason reported for using this as patient transport is that in townships maybe the roads are narrow and one can reach more people in this way, which has merit. What is hard to understand that if you pick up a really sick patient and you drive the motorcycle, who is taking care of the patient? The other concern is that it's all open and one does not know how far a sick patient needs to travel in a way unprotected. And the other concern would be the crime, where a lot of ambulances are attacked going into townships to pick up patients on an open transport vehicle. One's really unprotected, so those healthcare workers fetching patients in dangerous areas may be exposed to risk that is maybe not ideal.
Yeah. Now, what also is clearly evident is that the actual structure that the patients put in, if it's raining, they're going to get soaking wet, and also if the roads are slippery or bumpy and the motorbike falls over, what's going to happen to the patient? To me, it's just absolutely crazy. But let's go back to where we were talking about. I think we were talking about we were going to be talking about the advances in surgery for congenital heart defects. Would you like to just cover that subject for us, just to get us back into the heart area?
Yes, sure. The congenital heart defect has really been addressed successfully for the last 50 to 60 years. And up to the end of the previous century, there were a few survivors of intervention for congenital heart defects, but it's really developed into a subdivision of cardiac surgery where today, operative techniques are described and clear for most of the underlying abnormalities, and most children survive intervention for heart defects. The focus is really shifted from only surviving an operation like the last, say, up to the 1990s, to what over the last 20 to 30 years, one is more focused on the quality of survival. In other words, just like everything develops, everything gets more refined, outcomes get better, and there are many modalities contributing to that. The growing number of children that are born with congenital heart defects becoming adults has developed a whole new field in our specialty, and it's known as GUCH, G-U-C-H. That means grown-ups with congenital heart defects, and as they become adults, new problems are encountered because of the original problem that they presented with that were not known really some years ago. And there are various ways of addressing that. There are medical advances in newborn, the management of newborn babies was just like in transplantation with the discovery of cyclosporin. In congenital heart defects, a drug called prostaglandins are used to reopen the ductus, which is a structure that's normal before a baby is born because they don't use the lungs for breathing, and the blood goes from the mother to the circulation through this structure. This ductus closes at birth, and then one takes the first breath and have a normal circulation. But in some cardiac defects that have limited lung blood flow, in other words, if the connection between the right side of the heart and the lungs have not developed or is narrowed, sometimes you need reversed flow through that structure to buy time until one can establish a different form of lung blood flow. And this drug has saved the lives of many babies in the recent few decades,
Right.
to help them stabilize and have the surgery which they then need. It also is very helpful for some left-sided abnormalities, which we call, for instance, the hypoplastic left heart syndrome or narrowing of the aorta, which is also known as coarctation. In those patients that usually present totally collapsed and in really bad condition, it's magic to see how if one starts administering this drug, that the ductus open, the circulation is restored, and one can then fix the underlying problem in a patient that's in a much better condition. So that is a major breakthrough. Another advance that applies both to congenital and acquired surgery is the percutaneous implantation of heart valves. So what this means is that a valve, usually a bioprosthetic or what we call a tissue valve, it's made of animal products, is shrunk over a catheter, and then like one does an angiogram, the catheter is fed into the circulation from the groin, and then a balloon inside this valve is expanded, and a valve can be seated where it's needed, either for a narrowed valve or a leaking valve, and that saves patients in congenital heart defect sometimes multiple reoperation to insert new valves as the other ones degenerate. But it's also a very useful tool, for instance, in old patients that are not fit to have major surgery,
Right.
to have something like aortic stenosis. It's a severe narrowing of the valve that leaves the heart between the left ventricle and the circulation, to place a valve in that way with excellent outcomes and saving the patient a major operation.
Well, I have to say that non-invasive surgery is fantastic. I mean, the way medicine is going, it's incredible. Now,
Yes.
let's have a look at another area. Advances in adult cardiac surgery, like repair rather than the replacement of disease. I think we just talked about that, haven't we? So let's go on to. Have we just talked about that? I think we have. Yeah. So
We did in a way. I think maybe just a bit more. I mean,
Sure.
a diseased heart, it's like, which is unfortunately still quite prevalent in this country due to rheumatic fever. In the old days, when a valve was diseased, one used to take the valve out and put an artificial valve. And there's been beautiful techniques described of repairing valves. So if a valve is diseased and it is a valve that could be repaired, it's far better for the patient to retain his own valve or her own valve than to have an artificial valve. And those are the ones that are also now addressed with lesser invasive procedures, not necessarily the catheter-based valve implantations, but also surgery through smaller incisions, and that is called minimal invasive heart surgery, and that's also an advance that came over the years and that is commonly practiced nowadays.
Right. Now, the need for delivery of care for millions of indigent babies and children in Africa with no or poor access to corrective surgery, how is that going to be sorted out?
Well, I think at this stage it's really hard to say, but even before this abnormal times that we are in at the moment, there had been a huge need for care or cardiac care of babies that are born in Africa. The number of the population growth in Africa is expected to be exponential in the next 100 years compared to the rest of the world. Now, this virus is going to impact on that is, of course, something we were unaware of a couple of months ago. But up to before then, the major problem was that those patients had nowhere to go. And in some centers, there had been or there are collaborative projects. For instance, a well-resourced unit in America or Europe or the UK would make some missions to hospitals in Africa where they would fly in, fly out, do 10 procedures in a few days or a week or 2 or 3 and go. But that does not help the local unit to establish something that's sustainable for themselves. So although it does benefit the few patients that are operated on in the week, which is much better than having nothing at all, that effort should be taken further to also empower the people that are there to do the work themselves. A problem for young surgeons in Africa, which is something I am quite acutely involved with, is that the doors close for them to train in what we can call first world countries. It's not easy if you come from Africa to do clinical work and to obtain first-hand experience in a big, well-resourced center like we could do when we were young. I could go to London and spend time with a good surgeon there, and I really learned a lot from that. But those opportunities are becoming less and less. And what we are trying to do through various mechanisms is to rather empower these people, like sharing the knowledge. Sometimes they can spend time with us, which is a little bit easier than going to overseas units. We can spend time with them, and I have done that, and so did some of my colleagues, but not in the role of going, do the operation and leaving, but rather going and helping people to do it themselves, because that's the only way that it's going to be sustainable in the end. There are various other ways that this can be done, and that had been done also most successful across the world. I hope that travel restrictions will be less quite soon, so that those projects can continue. In the interim, what we try to do is with little short meetings on Zoom or Skype to just keep the educational part of this going.
Right. Now, I'm going to start putting questions to you that have come through the side chat. I've got a bunch here, so we better start getting into them. Charlotte Smith says, what age were you when you did your first heart transplant operation?
I think I was about 32. It was, I think, 1988, and I was just sort of towards the end of my training. I once looked up to date, but I actually can't remember. In my early 30s.
Right. Now, Rob Roy has asked, how many heart transplants are done annually worldwide now, just roughly?
Oh, I actually have the figure. I think it is, I must say, I have to look it up, but it's quite a lot. I don't want to say 100,000, but that is possible. I actually have some slides there. If I can look at that, if you give me a minute,
sure,
I can give you a bit.
All right, guys, while Susan's looking for that, if you have any further questions, please put them into the side chat. I'm finding this very, very interesting. It's always great to get, expert information from someone in a field that's so important like this. And Dan Berryman, another question while you're just looking. What does Dr. Vosloo think of the Cuban doctors that the ANC government requested? Well, I think we covered that, haven't we?
Let's talk about that. Yes.
Yeah, okay, we'll let that one go. Eric has asked, Inov Rapley has asked, did Dr. Vosloo meet or have any dealings with Professor Barnard's attorney? Now, I'm not sure why he's asking that, but that's a question.
No, I haven't. No,
okay.
Sorry, I did not.
Now, Inov Rapley has asked, I wonder what the doctor's thoughts are regarding mass ventilation of COVID patients when the only time most patients are ventilated is for elective surgery. How are they sanitized?
I think the hospitals keep different zones for patients with and without COVID. So in most hospitals there are 3 zones. They color-coded it. A green zone is a patient that knows no exposure and is no risk, and those are patients that are kept separate. The red zones are patients that have a confirmed COVID. In other words, they had a positive test. And the yellow or orange zone are what is labeled patients under investigation. So those patients are kept individually because they may turn out to be positive and move to the red zone, or they may turn out to be negative and move to a green zone. That's the way most hospitals are handling this. The hospitals are, in a way, over preparing for the COVID. And it's hard to say because it's only now that the numbers are really increasing. And I'm not sure where we are, if it's near the peak of the curve or if we've already passed the peak of the curve in the Western Cape. Time will show in the next days to weeks. But in practical terms, our hospitals have basically been put on hold for COVID since the middle of March. So it's 4 months now that we have, for instance, only done emergencies. It's hard to bring patients in if they're scared to come to hospital and if they are placed at risk. So it's something that most hospitals and most medical practitioners have respected. If this is something that's going to be with us for months to come, the focus should really change on how we're going to fulfill our responsibilities to the bigger part of the population that do not have COVID. And we have been slow to acknowledge what happened in the rest of the world. On Friday, we had an Africa surgical meeting, and there was a surgeon from Mount Sinai in New York, where they had a huge number of patients. And what he said was that we had this surge of patients. We brought in 100 extra beds and put them in the passages and everywhere in the hospital and never used them. My instinct is that the same is going to happen here, that we are totally over preparing. I I hope I'm wrong, but the 1,000 ventilators that the US donated to Africa, why did they do it? Because they didn't use it.
Yeah.
And to come back to the question about ventilation, I did mention before that this is, although it's a respiratory illness, it's not only a lung disease. So the lungs provides the entry for the virus, but there are systemic effects, and the systemic effects are causing organ organ damage. But even the lung signs are seem to be a combination of actual respiratory airway abnormalities as well as vascular abnormalities. So there's a component of increased blood clotting, and the approach nowadays, and it changes all the time, is the focus has really changed to anticoagulating the patients. In other words, they need oxygen, but not so much that the airway is so sick, but that the blood supply to the lung is impaired. But it's of course not only the one or the other. That patients that need oxygen and some other therapeutic measures with ventilation, which we call non-invasive ventilation, and positioning to favor the lung function. It's really a small percentage of patients that deteriorate enough to need ventilation. But if they do need ventilation, they are really sick, and the outcome of patients that are so ill that they need to be ventilated is much worse than those where you can avoid ventilation. I think the perception that ventilation is the first treatment is not correct, and it's not practiced nowadays. And I don't think it has been that much of a factor most places. One will have to see. I cannot make that prediction, but the initial prediction in South Africa in the first model was that 300,000 people will die. Then it was something like 40 to 80,000. Now it's something like 20 to 40,000. And a very academic group called PANDA, P-A-N-D-A, have done extensive modeling and remodeling. And their opinion is that maybe 10,000 people may die, maybe more, maybe less. One cannot say. Time will show.
Right. Now, Mike Simpson has asked a similar question. He says, please ask Dr. Vosloo, our doctor says we must take half a dispirin a day to keep the blood thin. He says it helps with the COVID. Now, you've just talked about thinning the blood. Is that going to help?
I think so. I mean, that is just instinctively, I think it will help. The other, what else has been mentioned in terms of benefit is zinc and vitamin D. That is also a preventative. Vitamin D and calcium and zinc and vitamin C, there are preparations like that have been shown to have some benefit. For the inflammatory response or the cytokine storm, there's a simple drug called dexamethasone that has now been reported to be of definite benefit, and that is quite cheap and quite readily available. But the use of that is not for the layperson to take. It's a tool in the hands of a medical professional taking care of these patients to administer it at the appropriate time that its action will have the best benefit.
Right. Now, I have to just tell you that the CEO of YouTube, which is where we're now doing this live stream, said that one of the great fallacies, this is in an interview that she had when they were talking about taking videos down related to COVID and all the theories. And she said that one of the great fallacies is that vitamin C helps you. And she said if she sees videos concentrating on the subject, which are talking about vitamin C actually being, a way of helping protect against COVID-19, they would take those videos down.
Really?
Isn't that
Actually,
incredible?
your video is going down.
Oh, no. It's only if you concentrate on that subject. So we better move on to something else.
Yes, stay safe.
Psych Doc asks, what role does a positive frame of mind, psychological wellness play in recovering from infractions, bypasses, and transplants?
If you've been in the game long enough, I would say it plays a major role. The patient's participation in their own healing is really important. If the patient doubts if they're doing the right thing, it's really important that a patient is comfortable that they are making the right decision in doing any major procedure. If a patient's hesitant and you can afford to wait, it's always safer to wait until they are ready and motivated. It just makes the recovery so much smoother. And that's not something like that has a definite scientific linear basis. But if you are negative in approaching your recovery, one will do things that will not aid your recovery. Maybe someone doesn't want to get out of bed when they need to be mobilized. They don't want to eat when they need the nutrition to recover, and all that type of measures that will enhance the better recovery.
Right. Now, Erica, IR has asked, the salicylic acid in aspirin can enhance the effect of anticoagulants from my recollection. Whether it is a mild anticoagulant, not sure. Will be interesting to get the doctor's input.
Yes, that is Disprin. That is Disprin's other name, and that it's a mild anticoagulant. It works on the platelets for what it's worth, and it does impair clotting, but not in a dramatic way. There had been calls for more aggressive anticoagulation, but a group of hematologists came out strongly in not supporting that, because if one used that unwisely, the risk of spontaneous bleeding can be extremely high. So it has merit, but it has a place in the hands of a professional taking care of it.
Right. Now, Lali Dutoy has asked, what is the risk with a tricuspid valve incompetence in both patient and donor, and the influence on a stem cell transplant? A tricuspid valve is not a very important valve in the heart. So in patients with, for instance, in drug users, where they get septicemia and they get infection of the tricuspid valve, it used to be that one can treat the infection in the old days by excising the valve and not replacing it. I don't think anybody does it nowadays, but what I'm trying to say, it's not a crucial valve in circulation. You can be alive without a tricuspid valve. The second is that if you do have tricuspid valve dysfunction and your heart's not 100% normal, for instance, if you have rheumatic heart disease and you already had surgery on the left side of the valve of the heart, those patients don't tolerate the tricuspid valve incompetence very well, and sometimes one needs to intervene. In transplantation as such, because often the donor atrial chambers, that's the collecting chambers, because of the heart failure, they are enlarged. So, and if one then implants a normal heart, the connection is at the level of the collecting chambers, and there is quite a size discrepancy. And when the heart then fills up, the tricuspid valve may become a bit dilated and leak. That's fairly common in transplantation, and there are surgeons that modify the implantation technique to
retain more of the total structure of the right atrium. There are surgeons that would preventatively narrow the ring of the tricuspid valve to prevent this, but it's not common practice either way. But those are the ways the tricuspid valve can be influenced. As for stem cells, I'm not personally aware of an application of stem cells in tricuspid valve disease. There are applications of stem cells in damaged heart muscle, but in tricuspid valve disease, it's something, if there is something, I do not know of it.
Right. And I've got another question here for you. What is Dr. Vosloo's take on the idea that nicotine can be a line of defense relating to COVID? And I think there was a doctor in Greece who was suggesting that smoking is actually a way of preventing COVID or catching COVID.
We live in a time where treatments and precautions will be coming and going. I think I have also heard that, I've also heard or read that something to the opposite effect. We all thought maybe having the flu vaccine, the normal flu vaccine, is going to be protective, but then there are reports that if you had a flu vaccine, the cytokine storm is worse. So it's really hard to know for each individual, but I do not think at this stage that information is there that one can generalize, and it's a moving target all the time. There was a lot of literature on the anti-malaria drug. There are some antivirals, some are more effective than others. There's some antibiotics that have been shown to be effective. And I think the current treatment also evolves, and the current treatment would include some of those things to a greater extent and some to a lesser extent. But I don't think it's universal, a fixed in stone approach that everybody is taking.
Right. Now, Antoinette, actually your question's coming next. She says, can you please put my question back up again? I think Scott missed it. Well, here comes your question, Antoinette. Now, Antoinette asks, my daughter had an ASD closure 20 years ago done by Dr. Harold Pribbett at the then City Park. You would know the fellow. With a stainless steel device. Yes. Is there anything she should worry about in the future regarding the device?
Dr. Pribbett is a pediatric cardiologist, and I work very closely with him. The device closure of an atrial septal defect is a bit similar to percutaneous valve replacement. It's a little device that's loaded on a catheter, and it's a bit like an umbrella. The catheter goes through the hole between the two collecting chambers. The one umbrella is blown up on the left side, and then another one on the right side. So, and it's connected with a little bar, and this is like a disc then closing the defect. Now, closure of ASD is a corrective procedure, and those devices get what we would call endothelialized. That means that the normal cell layer that lines the inside of the chambers of the heart will grow over this, so that if one ever opens the heart again, it will be an irregular surface, but it will be covered with normal lining cell layer. I don't think there's any additional risk in patients that had this procedure, and one can really approach life as if everything underlying is normal because it's fully repaired.
Right. Okay, Antoinette, I hope that answers your question. It's me again, says. We got some funny usernames here. Hi all. I was given rhesus factor blood transfusion at birth. Some believe someone else's blood can change your character. Have you heard of that, Susan?
No, I won't be able to comment on that. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Inov Rapli says, Dr. Vosloo, what impact does medical tourism have on affordability for local South Africans? And is this a feature of the South African medical landscape?
Yes, I think medical tourism is something that happens in the plastic surgery area, and it's for people that need, in a way, relatively not major procedures, or even maybe bigger procedures, would travel for cost reasons, maybe because it's more affordable if you come from areas where it's really expensive to an area where it's a bit more affordable, and also combine that with some leisure. There are people doing that. There are companies that organize trips like this. In our fields, it's not really something that practically happens, because major surgery is best done in the patient's comfort zone, where the family support is, where his infrastructure is strong, and even more where, should there be any care required in the longer term, that one is close to your caregivers. We do operate on patients of the surrounding countries like Namibia and Botswana and Zambia, but those patients are treated here because there are no facilities there. In the field of cosmetic surgery, the patients usually have a choice, and they would probably follow where it's affordable and the quality of service is good, like South African medicine is of high quality.
Right. Now, I've just was watching the side chat there for a second, and we have a fellow that's on our channel on live streams from time to time. His name's Isaac van Zyl, and he's having a triple bypass on Wednesday. And of course, please, everybody, if you can just keep him in your prayers. Now, can you explain to us what is a triple bypass? What does it involve?
Okay. A bypass is a short term for a revascularization of the heart. So the heart muscle is supplied with coronary arteries. They are the first branches that originate off the aorta after it's left the heart. They run on the surface of the heart and supply the heart muscle with blood from the outside to the inside. The typical disease that affect the coronary arteries is atherosclerosis or ischemic heart disease. What that basically means is that obstructions develop in the course of these arteries, but usually in the beginning, we call it proximal. So and the artery would come off the aorta, and a critical narrowing would develop over time, but the vessel beyond the narrowing is normal. Now, those patients are treated with bypass surgery. So one uses conduits either from arterial grafts, which we use an artery that runs inside the chest. You can also use an artery from the arm, or you could use a venous graft, which comes from a vein that's harvested from the leg. The bypass graft means that this graft, which is like a tube, is attached before and after the narrowing. In other words, that the blood that cannot run through the narrowing runs around it. And the number that's attributed to that, so like it's a double bypass or a triple bypass or a quadruple bypass, is determined by how many narrowings you have in how many vessels. In other words, if you have a single narrowing, it will be a single bypass, although nowadays, single vessel disease is usually addressed by the cardiologist by opening the actual narrowing with the stent. When we do it, it's usually multiple vessel involvement. In this man, it will be 3 bypasses, which means that there are 3 little vessels that have meaningful obstruction and that needs blood flow beyond the obstruction, which is achieved with a bypass.
Right. Right. Now, Antoinette asked another question. She says, my daughter had a non-invasive heart procedure, 1 centimeter cut in the groin. She was the second patient done in Cape Town. She was in the trial group in South Africa. It's interesting. Would that have been before you got into medicine?
No, I don't think so. I think there are minimal invasive or cutaneous procedures. These are usually done by the cardiologist. So it's out of the surgical field. Although we closely work with cardiologists, some procedures are more in the field of cardiology than in our field.
Right. Now, what is your correct technical term in medicine? You've just talked about cardiologists and we have anesthetists. What is your correct technical term in the work that you do?
I qualified as a cardiothoracic surgeon. So surgeons actually fix the problem. The cardiologists tell us what to do. The cardiologists would do the investigations, determine the problem, and present the problem to you to repair it. Over time, there are some surgical interventions that were taken over by the field of cardiology, and that has really mostly been in the field of coronary artery disease, but also now in valve disease with the transcatheter valves and in congenital defects, for instance, closing of certain holes. And depending on the skill of each individual cardiologist, they would determine which can be managed in a lesser invasive way, which is preferred by the patients as long as it is in their safest interest.
Right. Okay. I'm pleased you cleared that up because I find it very confusing with all these technical names. Now, Ron Stone has asked, please ask Susan if her husband Anton is still her anesthesiologist when operating. And is Anton there? Maybe he can just say hi to everybody.
Yes, he's in the house, but he's fairly far away.
Oh, okay, right.
But he is still working. His practice have always been my anesthetist. He worked with other colleagues. At the moment, he's working with a very young, very nice, very competent young female anesthetist who trained in Tygerberg and then spent quite a number of years working in cardiac anesthesia in the UK. And she's joined us. We know it's very much a team effort. Cardiac surgery, it's not done in isolation by a single person. You need very competent and dedicated people on all levels. So we work, for instance, I have a surgical assistant, a very experienced scrub nurse. The perfusionists play a major part. They are the people that run the heart-lung machine, and the anesthetists are also crucial to the outcome of the operation. But in cardiac surgery, an even more important part of the care of the patient is afterwards. The intensive care unit, the nurses that look after the patient, they are with the patient all the time. And anything that happens expectedly or unexpectedly, they are the first line of care, and one relies heavily on them to be able to support the good outcome of anything you do.
Yeah. Now, it must be rather strange when you're performing an operation, your husband is part of the team. Do you sort of just, I guess it's, you deal with it very professionally, don't you? You just sort of like, you don't consider anything else.
Actually, yes, it is. One doesn't want to depersonalize it, but if I would have to say, a week ago with Mr. Smith, who was the anaesthetist, I have no personal connection whether it was my husband or his partner, because they have their own set of activities and function and responsibilities in the procedure, and we have ours. So although we do interact in different ways, it's very much pre-planned activities that is not so personalized. Although you do get used to little habits people have, like you have with anybody that you spend time with.
Yeah, well, I think it's a wonderful bonus for a patient that, you obviously know you as a team, you must be a fantastic team, because for years and years and years you've been working together, which is a huge plus in as far as I'm concerned. Now, Lali Dutoy has asked, what is the risk with a tricuspid valve incompetence? I think we've done this one, haven't we? Well, let me just go. Yeah, I think we have done that one, yeah. I think it might have been someone else who asked that question, though. Okay, now, Monkey Pushing Wood. We have some funny people's usernames here. Can this COVID-19 mutate to a deadlier strain?
I don't know is the answer. In the beginning, we thought that most viral infections become less virulent with time. In other words, a virus that comes, a seasonal virus, usually by the end of the season, or in the beginning of the season, it's more severe, and by the end of the season, it sort of is not so potent anymore. With this virus, it doesn't sound like this is happening. The virologist that one has heard of on interviews and in some of the literature have indicated that the coronavirus, I think there are 32 coronaviruses, and the one we are dealing with now may not be the one that we're dealing with next year, but I apologize for not really being the person that is totally qualified to answer this in a meaningful way.
Yeah, but doesn't the flu mutate every year, and you get some bad ones and you get some not so bad ones year in, year out?
Exactly. But how much the coronavirus will differ from the normal influenza virus is hard to say.
Right.
I think that is something that is still in development, and maybe in a year or two we will be able to look back far more wisely on this period that we're in now, which is very uncertain on various levels.
Now, I have to tell you something, share with you a secret. I haven't had the flu since I was 18 years old. I haven't been in a hospital bed. I haven't been sick in bed since I was 18 years old. I had the flu very badly when I was 18, and I actually fainted and collapsed on the floor. Is there any particular reason why I just don't get the flu now? What is it? Why? Because some people, they just get the flu at the drop of a hat.
Yes, I think it depends on your own immunity. People have various levels of immunity. Some people are more susceptible to infections, others are less susceptible. It probably also has a connection on your habits. So, for instance, like the prevention of this virus by hand hygiene, not too much close contact with people, and avoiding people that are sick is also beneficial. I don't think that there is one single reason that, you were lucky, and I think it's very fortunate, but it may be a reflection of the way you live. Maybe you just have a healthy living, habits with not too much interaction with other people, where a risk could be of contracting some illnesses.
Right. Okay. Now, Dan Berryman has asked, this second phase occurring in some countries, would this be the same COVID-19 or a more deadly mutation which apparently happened with the AIDS virus? Now, I think we've actually answered that question, Dan. Is there anything further you'd like to say about that, Susan?
Yeah, I think there's so many phrases that has materialized in this period. The first wave and the second wave, or is the second wave just a continuation of the first wave? There are so many factors influencing it. I think maybe why there is an upswing or a second wave could be that people become more relaxed than they should be when they think we are over the bump. So I think what seems to become very clear is that you should have a certain level of awareness and take responsibility for your well-being yourself. Nobody can really protect you as well as yourself. You should be, one should be sensible. I think the precautions that are advised are very sensible. Some things I think it's a bit of an overreaction, but we live in a time that nobody really knows, and one can only be respectful to this.
Right. Now, I'm going to get back to a few questions that I've got for you now, and first of all, I just want to say fantastic congratulations. You were the first woman to actually conduct a heart transplant in the world, weren't you?
No, in our country, in South Africa, there was a woman in America that did a transplant a year or two before I did. I must say, I never looked at it.
Yeah.
Lately, I had to write a paper about women in surgery. What I can say, in Cape Town, about 3 years ago in 2017, I did a transplant on a man where the donor came from the Eastern Cape. And the next day, somebody made me aware of the fact that 3 women surgeons did the 3 transplants from the same donor. So I did the heart. A colleague of mine, Ilmin Stein, did the kidneys, and Ilmi Miller, who works at Grooteskier, did the liver transplant.
Wow.
Not one of us knew before, but we were made aware of it afterwards. And I thought that was rather an advance from some 20 and 30 and 50 years ago, and
absolutely
that nobody could plan, and it was quite an interesting experience.
Yeah. Now,
in retrospect.
How is your time going, Susan? I don't want to overstay. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've been going for over 2 hours now, but I'm finding this fascinating, and I know the people watching are. Do you still have time to spend? Because there's still some things people want to ask.
Yes, I'll do it with pleasure.
Fantastic.
I'm settled into which is not my comfort zone.
Okay, well, I've got a question here from, where is it? Fiona Timms. Now, Fiona is one of our channel heroes. She's a lovely lady. She's not well. She's been sick, and it's lovely to see her here in the side chat. And she says, please ask Susan, how actually serious is the coronavirus? I've met a couple of doctor friends in the UK who saw it. It's no worse than the common flu. Do you think it's no worse than the common flu?
I think it's a bad flu. It's a bad flu with increased risk if you have comorbidities. The comorbidities are advanced age, obesity, cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and diabetes. Those are the comorbidities that are standing out in terms of bad outcomes.
Right.
There are many people that had the coronavirus that don't get sick at all. That is usually the young patients. Children seem to tolerate it very well. Children do not seem to transmit it. There's very good interviews on the social media by a colleague of mine called Fiona Kritzinger about the coronavirus in children and this whole controversy of should children go to school or not. In the beginning of this lockdown, one of the huge injustices, in my opinion, was taking children out of school because the potential disadvantage in interrupting the education versus the risk is not measurable. And there are social advantages too, where many children here only are fed at school, and those children have definitely not benefited from that.
Yeah. Now, Inov Rupley has asked a really interesting question because we haven't actually touched on this yet, and that is, has the flu vaccine ever been associated with the onset of neurological disease? Now, I want to ask you a couple of questions about vaccines, but if you just want to ask or answer that one first.
I think so. The vaccines have played a major role to the advantage of medicine over the years, and there are, as with any treatment, has side effect or disadvantages, or and those things can happen. But I think on balance, a vaccine is a way of developing immunity against something where the development of the disease itself is more harmful, like measles. So vaccines against measles have saved many lives because measles can make patients really ill and can cost lives, like smallpox. And there are a number of those things. There are the anti-vaccine. The anti-vaccine voice is also very strong. Most pediatricians would not support the anti-vaccine view because of what I just said, that the benefit of the vaccine outweighs having the disease. The vaccine that's now being developed for the coronavirus is also controversial because it's really rushed, but the advances in medicine is amazing. I read reports where something similar to the actual virus can be manufactured, and then the vaccine can be made using that, which has, as a result, you don't have a dead virus, or you have an artificial structure mimicking the virus that the vaccine is being developed against. But these things are ongoing, and until it's gone through all the necessary controls and become available for use, one cannot really comment on that. But like any treatment, one should consider the treatment only if the benefit outweighs the risk. And in general, the use of a vaccine is beneficial. I'm not sure the vaccine will come before natural immunity, but I do not think anybody would be advised to deliberately develop the coronavirus infection. Quite a number of my colleagues have had it, even older, even overweight, even people with comorbidities, and they seem to have come through it relatively unscathed. But I don't think anyone can deny that some people are more vulnerable, and one has to be sensible in protecting yourselves.
Right. Now, I have to say, I have a problem with, I'm one of those anti-vaccine people. It's because what I read, and I'll tell you why. So many people tell me, and I read so many reports, that you've got young children who, as a result of having a vaccine, get autism or ADHD or all these terrible side effects. Now, not only that, but apparently what they put into vaccines are things like a little bit of mercury or some other stuff which is poisonous to the system, and they do that deliberately to make the body react to the vaccine, which then actually makes it work. Now, I don't understand how the thing works. I'm only just telling you what I've heard. Can you explain to us about those two particular issues?
I think that autism has been a controversy for many years. It is so that autism signs starts showing more or less at the same time as that children get vaccinated, and if there is a direct link, it's rather hard to say. Most pediatricians would not support that view. I cannot say that I am the person who is best qualified to comment on that, and I'm really giving a lay opinion. I think it's for each individual to analyze for themselves whether taking a vaccine for something in particular is going to be safer than having the actual disease. In young people nowadays, with the information we have available now, I think it would be hard to recommend or to widely recommend vaccination, just as the kids do not really get very ill from this, but it may be that information changes in some weeks and months to come. At the moment, I think should a vaccine become available, it would be sensible for highly vulnerable, susceptible people to consider it, and they think the benefit is more than the risk to take it. But that's very much a personal decision.
Yeah. Now, the thing that really annoys me is that they're talking about restricting travel if you haven't had the vaccine for COVID-19. I mean, I don't understand the logic behind that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think at this stage it's hard to measure that, because the antibody test is only coming in the next few weeks. There is not even an antibody test in use at this moment, at this time in this country. It's coming in the next week or so. Right. So antibodies are, so if you get an infection, the virus is the antigen. Your response makes antibodies. Now, from what I understand, from what I've read and what I've heard, is that the coronavirus can change its structure, and that what you may be measuring now may not be what you need to be immune next year. But it's also new science, and I'm not sure that one can really generalize in commenting about this. But it's going to be an individual decision, how vulnerable you are, what will the benefit be, and what will the potential side effects be. But I don't think I would be supportive of a generalized, everybody has to be vaccinated, no vaccine, no antibodies, no travel. I think that is because the epidemic or pandemic is not run by doctors. It's run by people that do not on the ground have direct management of this, and that's the media is also assisting in these perceptions, which is not to the benefit of people. We are creating a society that lives in fear. The social interactions will be really abnormal, and I think it's reached the stage where it will never be, in a way, the same again, which is really sad. And travel is an important part of life. It's an important part of widening one's views. It creates employment for so many people, and it will be a pity if that is very restricted as a result of this.
Now, Mike Simpson has asked, is it dangerous for a child with asthma to go back to school?
Again, if the asthma, because this I've heard from Fiona Kritzinger, because I watched her videos, what she said, and I can more or less quote as I understand it: if the child's asthma is well controlled on medication, the risk should be like normal risk. But if you're in any doubt, the sensible way to approach is to discuss it with your pediatrician or with the person who's treating the asthma, and then to decide on balance, is it safer to homeschool a child, or is it in order to send a child to school? Because there's so many factors of going to school for children to interact with other children, to the education, the development is definitely, there is a huge loss for children. Even these few months, my secretary has small children, and the kids are very disturbed and very uncertain about going to school, because as small as they are, they experience it acutely, and the introduction of the sort of obsessive compulsory behavior. Now you have to wash your hands, you have to do this, you have to do that. I think we have to develop ways of being sensible and self-protecting without going overboard and making a society that is fearful and for reasons that are maybe not totally justified.
Right. Now, Juanita Burta has asked, the autopsies done on COVID patients have clearly shown blood clots. Is this the reason why we should take Disprin?
Yes, but you need more than Disprin. I don't think, I wouldn't say just take Disprin. I don't think it would be wrong to do that, because I do think that some effect on prevention of blood clotting may have some benefit, but this is purely subjective. But what the treatment is at the moment is that it's not only lung support in the sense of oxygen and non-invasive ventilation. A part of the treatment is also the introduction of anti-clotting agents like Disprin, but more than Disprin is what is used in the hospitals at this stage.
Right. And Marlena, who you know, Marlena de Villiers, she's asked, why was it initially called coronavirus and suddenly changed to COVID-19? Now, it's interesting because COVID-19 is actually an acronym when you think about it, because it's CO, corona, V, virus, ID, like this whole thing, and then 19. So a lot of people are saying that this COVID-19 is actually an acronym for like an ID type, like a chip, that when you get your vaccine, there's some kind of COVID-19 identifier that remains in the body after you've been vaccinated. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think this is it's a bit maybe has some conspiracy flavor to this.
It does.
The COVID is, but the corona is, the CO is the first two letters of corona. The VI is the first two letters of virus. And I would say it stands for coronavirus disease. 19 is the year that it was first identified. There are several strains of coronavirus. So I think if my memory serves me right, it's about 32. And I'm sure there would be new ones that are discovered with time. So this is just an identification of the virus. It's not an identification that would be personally connected. I think that's I don't think I would support that view.
So there's no conspiracy behind it, is what you're saying.
Well, there are conspiracy theories. We've heard a few of those, but that really needs to be unpacked and investigated. There's some tension between China and Australia because Australia wants some independent investigation into the lab where it maybe was first discovered. There's multiple conspiracy theories, and like we say in Afrikaans, waar daar 'n rookie is, mag daar 'n vuurtjie wees. So I don't want to just deny those things because there may be some base in that. I think it may not have been a deliberate act that caused the virus to come into the population. It may have been an accident, but unless one looks at that and try to get behind what happened. But at this stage, I think it's more relevant to actually manage the disease or manage the spread or make it as light as possible. There are much more important, immediate issues to address. Those are things that can be analyzed later on, and then there may be some basis to that. It's hard to say until one knows.
Okay. Now, I just want to put out a quick alert to those watching, and that is that most of you know Patrick. Now, Patrick's just sent me a Skype message saying that there's a family in Johannesburg that have lost everything because of a fire. And if anyone is able to help, could they please just contact Patrick? I think Marlena could certainly give people Patrick's email address in the side chat so they can speak to him. Okay, now let's look at the next question, which is from Erica, and she says, aren't we in danger of lowering herd immunity from all these precautions, masks, washing hands, disinfecting surfaces, etc., which has been forced on us? Before you answer that question, I have another secret I've got to let out here, because it's just I worked at Barclays Bank from 1973 to about 1982, so I had about 10 years in the bank. And a good 7 years of that was spent as a teller. And I would be counting notes all day long and putting them into my money tray. And I used to take my little lunch pack with me and eat it at the back, during my lunch break. And I never washed my hands. So I would be eating sandwiches with who knows what was on those banknotes, but for 7 years I never got sick. Now, she's raised a really good point, because if you take away the contact with viruses and whatever they are, you'd have the right words, but do you think the reason I haven't had flu is because I've got so much immunity through what came through the banknotes that nothing can touch me now?
Yes. I think one needs, children in particular need exposure to nature to develop immunity. Right. There are, of course, children born with immune deficiencies that need to be protected, but normal, healthy children need that exposure. We all need some immunity to naturally build up, and the hygiene precautions will definitely, to some extent, reduce that. But I do not think it will be something that will have a lasting effect unless you really take it to extremes.
Like I did.
Like you did to the one side, but you can also do it to the other side. It's washing hands appropriately is very important, but washing your hands every 10 minutes is maybe a bit of an overkill. So again, you need to be sensible. We have a policy, or it just naturally is like that. If we enter the unit where our patients are, you wash your hands before you go to the patient. When you leave the patient, before you go to another one, and before you go to another one, you wash your hands. So that is very much the way we manage, and how you should basically be managing hand hygiene. And the masks, I'm a bit ambivalent about the mask. It's a rule now, but those masks, to be effective, are really cause quite a lot of congestion, and I'm not sure. It's without risk, although it's definitely with benefit in conjunction with other measures. Definitely, if you deal with sick patients, or if you are sick yourself, whether you have been confirmed to have COVID or whatever other viral infection, it would be sensible to protect those around you. But the universal use of masks, I think, have implications in terms of pollution. If I see how many masks are being used, I think with a very small benefit if it's healthy people among each other. I don't think that the viral load among healthy and asymptomatic people is the same as when you have a really sick patient who is carrying a lot of the virus and can potentially transmit a lot of that to somebody else.
But, well, I have to tell you that a lot of the ladies in the side chat are extremely jealous, and they're basically, the comment is that Susan is absolutely gorgeous, and they've they've worked out your age, and they're saying, how can this be? So there's a lot of comment about that. So I guess it's just good genes. Now,
I can say thank you.
DJ has asked, would you recommend any further form of supplementation, baby aspirin, etc., for a healthy 55-year-old male, no chronic conditions, that already takes omega-3 fish oils and has a solid diet?
Yes, I think it's probably unnecessary, because the omega oils act a little bit like a low-dose aspirin. So if you take something like that, I mean, of course, I don't think it will be harmful to take that as well, but I do not think it's really necessary to do so. Right.
Okay. Now, guys, if you haven't subscribed to the Loving Life channel, please make sure you do. Now, Michelle Mullard has asked, please ask Doc why doctors don't get sick during flu season. My doctor has never given me a proper answer.
Maybe because we wash our hands so much.
So it's sanitation.
You don't wash your hands, so I don't know.
Right. Now, I'd like to, look, we've been going for over 2.5 hours, so I'm going to be wrapping up this live stream shortly, but, you know, we've got a huge amount of information from you, and it's been very, very interesting. I hope those people who have been watching and have posed questions have learned. Now, I heard that you have an extraordinary story to tell, and I'll just tell you, I'll give you a bit of an insight as to what I'm talking about. One of my moderators in the side chat here, her name is Michaela, and she is she's not a young lady, but she's having twins. Now, apparently you've got twin daughters who would be about 20-year-old now, about 20 years old,
Yes.
wouldn't they? Now, tell us the
Yes.
story about that. I mean, tell us about the issues you had and what happened, and yeah, just tell us the story.
Well, we were very fortunate or privileged to, after a long period of fertility treatment. Of course, you wake up a bit late, and maybe you think it would have been nice to have a family, and then it's just not possible. And when I was over 40 and after 13 failed in vitro exercises and serious complications, we were more or less ready to call it a day when my brother's wife, who had two young boys, offered to be a surrogate mother. And after the first treatment, she was pregnant with twin girls, and we've been so privileged to have the most gorgeous children. They've been an absolute pleasure. They finished school. They're now both studying, one studying medicine and the other one is studying accounting. They are delightful children that we are very proud of, and we will forever be grateful that it's worked out like this for us. I don't know how one can ever thank somebody enough for making a sacrifice like that.
Absolutely amazing. Now, I'm going to be wrapping up the live stream now. I don't think we have any further questions. Sorry, I'm just checking the side chat. I don't see any in there. I think we've asked a huge bunch of you anyway, so it's time we gave you a break. I would like to just ask you, is there something you would like to say to those who are watching the video now, who might watch it later? Any message, anything about heart condition, anything about the coronavirus, whatever comes into your head? Is there something you'd like to tell people?
Yeah, I think what I would like to say is people are really able to look after themselves, and I always use a quote, more or less. I can't remember exactly the words by a man called Jim Rohn, where he says, "Let the opinions of others educate and inform you, but let your decisions be the product of your own imagination." And I think it's important to listen to opinions. It's important to make observations, but in the end, you can decide for yourself how you want to proceed. And that's all I want to say.
Fantastic. I love that quote. I absolutely love that quote. Now, before I thank everybody, there's just a comment I want to make, and that is tomorrow night, we will be talking to a man who has studied Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, and we'll discuss its implications on you personally. So that's going to be a very interesting subject. And now, let's have a look at the side chat. To the moderators, thanks guys, you've done a fantastic job once again. Thanks Marlena for putting Patrick's email address in the side chat. If someone can help that family with maybe clothing or furniture or something like that, please just give Patrick an email or send him an email. So thank you to the moderators. Thank you for those who've participated in the side chat, people who've just come in and joined the live stream. Great to have you on the journey. I've learnt a huge amount. I mean, my dad had a stroke when he was in his early 70s, but you know, I have a heart like a horse because I was a long distance runner. But I just want to thank you, Susan, for a fabulous and really interesting discussion. I'm sure that lots of people, and we'll just keep this video on the channel, and I'll send you the link, so if you want to put it up in social media or send it to friends or whatever, you're welcome to do that. But I just want to thank you so much for your time. You know, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the live stream, and please take care, and everybody else is watching, please take care, guys. We live in a strange world at the moment. Okay.
Thank you so I enjoyed your company. It was I'm very grateful for the invitation and dragging me out of my comfort zone and letting me settle into this after an hour or two. Thanks so very much. I enjoyed it.
Well, you've done a fantastic job. Everybody loves you to bits in the side chat, I can tell you. Annie says, you look like such a beautiful lady. They're all so jealous of you. Anyway, all right, guys, please take care. Don't forget, tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we'll be having another live stream, and I'm going to sign out now. So, chat to you hopefully